Welcome to our webinar on modern process validation. I'd just like to start by running through, introducing myself. My name is Pete Gough. I'm an Executive Director here at NSF Health Sciences, and one of my special subjects is process validation. I just want to deal with some of the logistics. If you can hear me but not see me, you should need to log into the ReadyTalk website using the access code that you were given. It's the same access code for the audio, and I hope anybody who can see this but can't hear me will understand that they need to log into the telephone to hear the audio. Now we have several hundred people online at the moment, so obviously it's not going to work if you're all talking, so I will keep all of the phones, all your phones on mute. It will just become a cacophony of noise if we all try and talk. If you need to contact us, can you use the chat box that's in the bottom left-hand side of your ReadyTalk screen and use it to send messages? So without further ado, let's get started. I will just give you an introduction to NSF Health Sciences. It may be a name you're not familiar with. We started life in 1986, and for many years were known as David Begg Associates, which I hope is known to many more of you. In 2007, we were acquired by NSF International, and we simplified our name to just DBA. In 2011, we became NSF DBA, and just at the beginning of this year, 1st of January this year, because NSF had purchased other consultancies, we all amalgamated to form NSF Health Sciences, and I'm speaking to you from the pharma biotech piece of that. NSF Health Sciences has three main arms: pharma biotech, medical devices, and in the States we have one group that deals with dietary supplements. So that's who we are. It may be a new name to you. I must admit I'm still getting used to calling myself NSF Health Sciences as opposed to DBA. Okay, so moving into process validation. The objective of this webinar is to look at what is really a paradigm shift in process validation. I'm going to go over relatively recent regulatory guidance, and the FDA is now 3 years old, but the EMA is playing catch up. The Europeans are about 3 or more years behind the US, so I will compare the FDA guidance. I'll introduce a bit of the FDA guidance and then compare and contrast that with what's coming out of the European Medicines Agency. So that is my objective for this session. So the FDA issued their new guidance on process validation just over 3 years ago now, in January 2011. And it certainly did represent a major step forward in the approach to validation. It effectively tore up the rulebook on validation that we've been using for the last 20 years and started again, and fundamentally changed the concept of process validation, something which Europe is still trying to catch up with, and I don't believe has fully caught up with. So let's first of all look at the FDA guidance. I know many of you may well be familiar with it as it's been around for 3 years, but I think it's worth just setting the scene because I want to compare and contrast what Europe is doing with the FDA. So let's just remind ourselves what's in the 3-year-old FDA guidance. It was completely new. It aligned process validation with the product life cycle. Process validation, by and large, had been seen as an event that happened around the time you were making a marketing authorization application, or perhaps a variation for one. And it also took on board the concepts that were coming out in Q8, Q9, and Q10 at the time, and now Q11. So it strongly endorses the quality by design approach, the scientific risk-based approach. There was a lot of emphasis on statistics. There was no 3 validation batches, no revalidation, so it was quite different. The scope is worth looking at. The scope included human and animal drugs. It included biological products. It included active pharmaceutical ingredients, and it included the drug constituent of a drug-device combination. It didn't include medicated articles, type A medicated articles. It didn't include medical devices. It doesn't include dietary supplements, which are subject to separate GMPs, and it doesn't include human tissues. The FDA quite literally redefined process validation. They came up with a completely new definition, and it is on the screen there. And as you can see, it's really emphasizing collection and evaluation of data from process design stage throughout production, which establishes scientific evidence that a process is capable of consistently delivering quality products. And I will contrast that with the still older European definition, which hasn't really changed, and because it is quite different. So it was trying to change the whole concept of process validation from being an event at one period of time to something that occurred throughout the life cycle pretty much. That you started to validate the process during the development phase, you then moved into commercialization and obviously releasing batches for patients, sale and supply, and process validation didn't stop all the time you were releasing product. It carried on, so it extended through what they called continued process verification throughout the commercialization phase. So it meant that we'd always viewed process validation as an event that happened around the time of first commercialization. And it really, the FDA's idea was to change that to, no, it's a journey that starts in development and really only finishes when you finish selling that product, when the product is withdrawn from the market. So it's a completely different concept of validation, a much broader definition, and that's probably one of the main things that you need to get your head around with the new FDA process. So what we want to do is, obviously, to start in development, the idea is you use knowledge from product and process development to establish your control strategy. Now, these terms very much come from ICH Q8, and it really is the quality by design approach. It's a little curious that the FDA guidance doesn't actually cross-reference Q8 and doesn't use exactly the same quality by design terminology. It doesn't use the words quality by design, but that's what they describe, that you need to understand the sources of variation, be able to detect the presence and degree of variation, to understand the impact of variation on the process and product attributes, and then obviously control that during your manufacturing process. So that is really the quality by design approach. So the FDA process validation is in three phases, three stages. Product and process development is stage 1, qualification of the commercial process is stage 2, and maintenance of the process in a state of control is stage 3. So we'll have a look at that. And throughout, it emphasizes using modern manufacturing principles, process improvement, innovation, and, quote there, sound science. So at stage 1, that's where you're obviously defining the commercial process based on the knowledge that you gain through development and scale-up, and you establish this control strategy. How are you going to control this product and this process, or control the process to produce a product that will meet its quality attributes? Stage 2 is the tricky one. You need to confirm that design is capable of producing reproducible commercial product. And so that is probably what we've historically considered to be process validation, whereas the Americans are saying, no, all three stages are process validation. And then you're not done. You don't give up. You need to have a mechanism to provide ongoing assurance during routine production that the process remains in a state of control. And the Americans call that continued process verification. We have to watch our terminology, because later on we'll see the Europeans are using the term continuous process verification for something completely different, which is and can be confusing. Grace McNally from the FDA provided this helpful diagram to explain the FDA's view of their process validation guidance. So there's the three stages, and you'll notice stage 2 itself is split into 2. And it includes the qualification, the design of facilities and qualification of equipment and utilities, as well as what they can call now process performance qualification. And it is really that PPQ, that process performance qualification, that probably historically we've all called process validation. That's that event that happens around the time of commercialization. But the FDA is saying, no, all 3 stages are process validation. And you're not done. You then, once you start to commercialize, you go into stage 3. And you'll notice there's some arrows showing that changes going back to design. If you do change something, you get if you might have to go back to the design and rethink it if you find out something that you didn't know before. So that can happen at any stage as well. So that's the FDA's quite a good diagram to describe the FDA's process validation. So if we look at each of those stages quickly in turn, the process design stage has 2 phases: capturing knowledge, that's your standard drug development experiments, and then using that knowledge to establish your control strategy. And it says in the guidance that may or may not incorporate PAT principles. In other words, what we'll see in a minute, the Europeans call continuous process verification, some mechanism to continuously monitor your process. But the important thing is that this control strategy is what you want to develop in stage 1. Then stage 2 is divided into 2 elements. 2A, qualification of the equipment and utilities. I'm not going to say anything about that other than just to point out that it is there. And then stage 2B is the process performance qualification, it's called, and that's where you use your statistics. And it does say products manufactured at this stage, if acceptable, could be released for distribution. So the big question is, when do you release? The answer is, that's a very big question. Each manufacturer, it says, should judge whether it has gained sufficient understanding to provide a high degree of assurance. So, how much testing is necessary? That's for you to decide. But it does make the note there that focusing exclusively on the qualification efforts, in other words, just doing experiments at this stage, without also understanding the manufacturing processes and associated variations, may not lead to adequate assurance of quality, which is really turning you back and saying, look, unless you've done your process design stage, you probably can't actually qualify the process, because you need that understanding you gain from the process design stage. So it's up to you to decide when you're in a state of control, and you need to decide when you've got enough. There is no mention of how many batches. The FDA are very much trying to kill this notion that it doesn't matter whatever you do, if you can make 3 batches reproducibly with everybody, all the technical people standing around and holding hands, 3 batches is good enough. And the FDA is saying, no, you've got to convince us, and it might be less than 3 batches, it might be many more than 3 batches. That just depends on, you've got to show us that you've got this state of control, and that the entire compilation of knowledge and information gained from the design stage through the process qualification stage gives you that confidence that you can start commercializing the product. And that's proved quite controversial. There's a lot of debate going on, is exactly how many batches and how do you decide how many batches. Professional organizations like PDA and ISPE have all been working on this and publishing papers on that. And that's still quite a hot topic for debate. And certainly those of you that are selling products into the US market will certainly need to be well aware of that, because the FDA are enforcing that. And then you're not done. Once you've commercialized it, the historical view is you've done your process validation, you can put it in those big fat folders, put it on the shelf and forget about it and walk away, and then carry on commercializing the product. And the FDA is saying, no, you're not done. You've got to provide continual assurance that the process remains in a state of control, which means you've got to have an ongoing program to collect and analyze product and process data that relates to product quality. And that data should be statistically trended and reviewed. So, these techniques are not new. It's using techniques like control charts, which Schuhart first published his book on control charts in 1931. So it's hardly new technology. It's just a darn sight easier to actually do these days with computers. You can put the data into a program like Minitab or Northwest Quality Analyst, and now pops a control chart very easily. So you've got to be control charting. You've got to work out your process capability periodically to check it is still capable, and it does refer in the FDA guidance to those statistical techniques. So that's the FDA guidance, and we've had it for 3 years now, and certainly the FDA have been enforcing it for anybody wishing to sell products into the US. Europe has been lagging behind, so let's have a look and see now what's happening in Europe. We had in 2012 a draft, and at the end of February this year, we had the final EMA CHMP guidance on process validation. It claims that it doesn't introduce any new requirements, but I'll leave you to judge that. I would point out to you, first of all, the scope. It's human products, it's veterinary products, it's biological products, but unlike the FDA, it is not applicable to active ingredients. So whereas the FDA guidance applies to APIs, the European guidance doesn't. This guidance. Now, what is this guidance? It's CHMP guidance on, and all the CHMP guidance is guidance for applicants for a marketing authorization. So this is guidance for somebody who is applying for a marketing authorization, or perhaps if you want to apply for a type 2 variation, you want to vary an existing marketing authorization. So that's what it applies to. So the other thing it's not in this guidance is any mention of the qualification of facilities, which is in the FDA guidance as stage 2.1, but in Europe that's in Annex 15 of the EU GMP guide, which is currently being revised. It's out as a draft, and we'll look at that in a minute. So this is the European definition of process validation. It really hasn't changed from the previous guidance. It talks about documented evidence that processes operate within established parameters, can perform effectively and reproducibly to produce a medicinal product meeting predetermined specifications and quality attributes. You'll notice it's quite different in its emphasis from the FDA guidance. In the FDA, you've got keywords like evaluation of data, process design stage throughout production. So the FDA is emphasizing this life cycle approach, the use of scientific evidence to show that the process is capable of delivering quality product. Now, in Europe, it's all about showing it meets already established parameters effectively and reproducibly, meeting specifications, meeting quality attributes. And the reason for that is the EMA guidance is not truly a life cycle document. You need to look at it. The Europe tackle the life cycle in a much more complicated way, whereas the FDA has a single document that covers process validation throughout the product life cycle. Europe doesn't. So if you look on the left-hand side here for the FDA, you've got the life cycle here. This is the FDA's product development, process validation, ongoing process verification, which they can all continued. In Europe, it's much more fragmented. Europe, for product development, simply refers to ICH Q8. And it's not mentioned in this guidance. It just says, in the guidance for development, refer to ICH Q8. This guidance really just deals with what we've historically called process validation. In other words, that event that happens at the point in time just before you make your marketing authorization application and that you put into that marketing authorization. So that's what this guidance covers. So it's much more narrow in its scope. And then the ongoing verification or continued process verification, as the Americans call it, is covered in EU GMP Annex 15, which we'll have a look at the draft of that in a minute. Now, so the European says there's 3 validation approaches. Number 1 is the traditional approach. Number 2 is what they call continuous process verification approach. And number 3 is a hybrid, in other words, a mixture of the 2. So let's have a look at those each in turn. Okay, so process validation, traditional approach. It's frankly not changed a lot from previous guidance. There is a little bit, it does say you can validate on pilot scale batches, but they must be at least 10% of full scale. But there is a caveat to that some products for biological and biotech products must be at full scale, which makes sense. This question of how many batches Remember, the FDA have done away with the 3 batches and you're done completely, and you have to justify however many batches that's going to be. The Europe, frankly, I think the guidance is, it doesn't make sense. It's internally inconsistent. It has a paragraph that says you must decide on how many batches based on variability of the process, complexity of the process knowledge gained during development, and supportive data that are commercial scale during tech transfer and overall experience of the manufacturer. That's all consistent with what the FDA says. But unfortunately, whereas the FDA leave it at just that and then don't make any mention of the number of batches, the next paragraph in the European guidance says data on a minimum of 3 batches should be submitted unless otherwise justified, which frankly doesn't really make any sense. Why 3? My personal view as some knowledge of statistics is 3 is never going to be enough. Probably 5 is going to be the minimum if you're going to prove anything statistically alone. But those batches don't have to be made. Perhaps all the same, if you've made a lot of batches at the commercial during the development, you might be able to pull in the data from that. And it does say data on 1 or 2 production scale batches may suffice where there is data supported from pilot batches, which is quite true. So Europe doesn't seem to be able to get away from this concept that there's something magic about 3 batches, which is disappointing. And as I say, I think it's internally inconsistent. That the statement on the previous slide that you base it on the variability of the process, complexity of the process, and the knowledge really isn't consistent with the next statements that, well, yeah, but as long as you do 3 batches, you'll be okay, is the implication. And I think that is a shame, and certainly won't wash with the US FDA. And then Europe introduces this phrase, continuous process verification. And what they mean is where you're using something like PAT, some sort of technology that's continuously monitoring a process. Rather than taking samples periodically and sending them to an offline lab, you've got some sort of inbuilt technology that continuously monitors some critical aspect of the process. And typically when you're getting all of that data, you're going to be using multivariate statistical process control tools to actually sort all that out. And so that's continuous process verification, and that's the other approach. It does list the information you need to provide if you're going to go down that route, details of the online, inline or at-line monitoring, details of the analytical methods, acceptance criteria, the statistical models or tools used, and very often these are going to be important because often it's based on mathematical modeling of the process. And it says if a design space has been developed, how the proposed monitoring will contribute to the design space verification. And we'll have a look at that. That's something, a new concept that's been introduced in both the EU and America fairly recently, this concept of design space verification. So it's not different from the FDA at this stage. It's probably perhaps spelt out a bit more in that it's picked out as a completely separate approach, whereas the FDA really doesn't make any difference, any distinction. It says it's up to you to decide how you're going to control your process and then justify it. And the hybrid approach is a mixture of the two, where you're using traditional end product testing for some quality attributes, and you'll be using a continuous process verification approach for other quality attributes. Now, in the US FDA, we had this continued process verification as the final stage of the life cycle. That obviously is going to be very easily confused with continuous process verification. So it has been dropped in the final version. It was in the draft, they used the phrase, and all they do now in the CHMP guidance is a little note saying, see Annex 15, and Annex 15 now calls it ongoing process verification. What did come in and wasn't in the draft but is in the final version is this concept of design space verification, and this has come out of the question and answer document that was published a few months ago from the joint study that was done between FDA and EMA of quality by design submissions. Both decided that you probably not, your design space is going to be based on very few batches when you first make your initial marketing authorization, application. And obviously, as you go into the commercial stage, you're going to get a lot more information, which you can then use to verify your design space. And if necessary, you might need to modify your design space, which would require submission of a variation. So that's built into, the Europeans are saying you need to have a protocol for design space verification included in your marketing authorization application. And so given here is the design space verification requirements and the fact that it does need to be included in your application dossier. So let's have a look at comparing the FDA guidance with this CHMP guidance that's now final, because both of these documents are final. The FDA guidance covers the regulatory dossier and manufacture. It covers everything. It's the whole life cycle. It's from development through commercialization. Whereas the CHMP guidance is aimed solely at assessors who are assessing the regulatory dossier. So it's very much focused on that traditional, if you like, process validation step that's part of making a regulatory submission. The FDA guidance covers APIs, whereas the Europeans doesn't. Inspection and ongoing process verification and qualification of equipment and facilities is covered in Annex 15. It's not covered in the CHMP guidance. The FDA have redefined process validation. Europeans haven't. The American guidance focuses far more on science, data, and statistics, whereas the Europeans is a little bit of an extension on what's gone before, but is not so radical perhaps as the Americans. In Europe, it still refers to ICH Q8 for the process development stage, whereas the FDA are now much more insisting on the quality by design approach to be taken for everything. Europe is still accepting the traditional approach, if you like. Americans are trying to get it to be phased out. As I said, qualification of equipment is in the American guidance, but it's not in the Europeans. That's in Annex 15, and I'll look at the draft of that in a minute. And in Europe, this 3 batches is still probably acceptable at what the Americans call the process qualification stage, what is still called process validation in Europe. And then this continued process verification is again covered in Annex 15 in Europe. It's not in the CHMP guidance. So I've talked enough about it. Let's have a look at what's in the new EU GMP Guide Annex 15. It came out more or less at the same time, just a few weeks before the final version of the CHMP guidance. It came out at the beginning of February. You still have an opportunity to comment. Comments are due by the end of next month, by the 31st of May. So if you wish, you can still make comments about this draft. It's obviously been revised to take into account of Q8, Q9, Q10, and Q11, technical developments such as PAT, and obviously trying to align with the new, what's no longer a draft, with the final version of the process validation guidance, which was a draft at the time that Annex 15 was published, but has since been finalized. So this is where we find the qualification of equipment, facilities, and utilities. It's largely unchanged in that it follows the DQ, IQ, OQ, PQ model, which I think everybody's pretty familiar with, but I'm very pleased to see that at last they have included probably, from my view, my personal view, the most important stage of the qualification of any equipment, facility, utilities, and that's the production of the user requirement specification. And it quite rightly says the URS should be a point of reference throughout the validation lifecycle. I made very strong criticism, both of the draft and of the final version of the previous Annex 15, and it made no mention of the requirements for a user requirements spec. But that is now in there, and that's really filling a very big hole. So that's good. It also includes requirements for factory acceptance testing and site acceptance testing. So it's understanding that in the real world, particularly if you're buying a major piece of kit, you may well do some of the testing before you ship it into your manufacturing facility or your laboratory, and you'll do some testing at the factory where the equipment is made, and then you'll do some other testing when it's first installed So what's traditionally called fats and sats has now been added. So again, that's catching up really what has been standard industry practice for more than a decade now, and is very much the approach that is in the ASTM, a US approach. So moving on to process validation, it makes reference to the CHMP guidance that is now finalized, and it uses the same terminology. It talks about traditional and continuous process verification approaches, and it says the basis, it introduces terms from ICH-Q8. It says you need to determine the basis for deciding which process parameters and quality attributes were identified as being critical or non-critical. So Q8 has talked about CPPs, critical process parameters, and CQAs, critical quality attributes. And so this is now saying in Annex 15, you need to decide and you need to describe the base and to be prepared to defend the basis for deciding which of your process parameters are critical and which aren't, and which of your quality attributes are critical and which aren't. So that's good. That's aligning with ICH-Q8. It does say that process knowledge from development studies should be the basis for validation activities. So in that sense, it's consistent with the US approach. And it does make the point that this is especially important where a design space is defined. It does say that if you're not making many batches, concurrent validation is allowed in exceptional circumstances. And if you're going to justify concurrent validation, you need to be able to demonstrate a positive risk to patient versus benefit to patients. So the sort of situation it might be is that it's an orphan drug that's only targeted at a very small population. You're not going to be able to make 3 or more batches and validate them in the traditional way. You might just want to make 1 batch a year, perhaps, is all you're likely to ever make. And in those circumstances, the benefit to the patient perhaps outweighs the risk of starting to commercialize something with perhaps as few as 1 batch of data. But it's up to the applicant, it's up to you, the company, to justify that. And obviously, that's got to be accepted by the authorities. And the language then used is very similar to the CHMP guidance. It says the number of batches manufactured and the number of samples taken should be based on quality risk management, allow the range of the normal variation and trends to be established, and provide sufficient data for evaluation. That's all very good and scientific and in complete alignment with the FDA guidance. Each manufacturer must determine and justify the number of batches necessary to demonstrate a high level of assurance that the process is capable of consistently delivering quality product. That is almost cut and pasted from the FDA guidance. That is very, very similar. Unfortunately, it then goes on and spoils it by saying, yes, but usually a minimum of 3 batches is sufficient. So for me, I just wish they'd dropped the 3 batches altogether and merely stuck with those statements there, which I think are entirely scientifically correct. That may mean that it may be anywhere from 1 or more batches, and you've got to determine it. But it does say that generally considered acceptable that a minimum of 3 consecutive batches. The reason I'm so upset that is there is because I strongly suspect what we're going to see is a fair degree of divergence around Europe. I think you're going to see regulatory authorities that are more progressive, perhaps like the UK, Ireland, Sweden, perhaps Germany, the more northerly European states, wanting you to justify and will point to the statement that says you have to justify how many batches. But I think you're going to see other member states simply say, or point to this other section and say, well, no, we're just going to carry on accepting 3 batches. And so I think this is possibly a recipe for inconsistency. When the draft first came out, I had hoped we might be able to make comments and criticize that. But now that they've finalized the CHMP guidance and that still has this 3 batches nonsense built into it, I think Europe is still wedded to it. Unfortunately, Europe is a collection of 28 member states, and obviously some of them were not prepared to let go of the magic 3, which I think is a great shame. It then goes on to describe the continuous process verification approach, that is where you're using some sort of PAT type tool. It says, products can be developed using QBD and can follow the continuous process verification approach. This should be science-based control strategy, and each manufacturer must determine and justify the number of batches. So definitely there's no guidance on the number of batches if you are using the continuous process verification approach. That is entirely up to you. And then again, it says you can use a hybrid approach. In other words, you can use the traditional approach for some parameters and the continuous process verification approach for other parameters. And then this is where we get the stage that's analogous to stage 3 of the FDA guidance. Europe has chosen, because it's using this phrase continuous process verification, it really couldn't use the phrase continued for this other step because it was just too confusing. So they're now calling it ongoing process verification. And it's exactly analogous to stage 3. And this is going to be a change for the industry. Even if you're not planning on submitting new products, and so you're thinking, oh, well, none of this applies to me because I'm not submitting any new marketing authorizations, this is going to be, once this guidance is finalized, is going to be enforced in Europe, and you're going to hear questions from GMP inspectors about what are you doing to show that you are ongoing monitoring your processes. Which statistical tools? It says statistical tools you should be used to support any conclusions with regard to the variability and capability of a given process and ensure a state of control. So it's going to become an expectation that you are continuously control charting your critical process parameters and occasionally working out your process capability. And frankly, that is a child's play these days. It is very, very easy to do with modern statistical process control packages. Please don't try and do this with Excel. You need to invest in a proper statistical process control package to do this, like Minitab or Quality Analyst or SAS JMP. All of those will do this very easily and do it properly for you. And you don't need to, providing you're using the standard functionality, you're not going to need to validate those computer programs. You're merely going to need to procedurally control how you use them. So let's have a look at where we are with process validation. The 2011 FDA guidance really sets the standard. It does talk about this life cycle approach with 3 stages from development through commercialization, and very much emphasizing science and risk-based approaches. The 2014 EU guidance is a move towards the FDA approach, but I would say it falls short of complete harmony. I think it's going to lead to fragmentation. Because the guidance is split up, it's saying, for development you just refer to Q8. You've got this guidance from CHMP as what you put into a marketing authorization application at a particular point in time, and then the ongoing stuff is in Annex 15. It's much more fragmented. It's much more difficult to figure out what you need to do, whereas the FDA have just got one guidance that covers everything and makes it much easier. And you have this situation where I'm sure that, and certainly in some member states, for a lot longer, this 3 batches is going to be acceptable, whereas it's no longer acceptable typically in the US. I would summarize that as saying that if you follow the FDA guidance, you should comply with the European guidance, but not the other way around. I think if you just applied with the European guidance, you may not necessarily comply with the FDA guidance. So if you just did 3 batches and said, well, that's what it says in Annex 15 and in the CHMP guidance, that's okay, you may well not get away with that with the US. So if you're truly trying to validate the same process for global supply, you're probably going to need to refer to the FDA guidance because I think you're going to find that's more stringently enforced. And it has been around for 3 years. Overall, this is a paradigm shift in thinking, though. Even the Europeans, I'm sure, are going to shift in time. The concept that you need to do ongoing process verification is with us, and certainly is coming in. I certainly know that some MHRA inspectors are starting to ask questions in this area, even though Annex 15, the new Annex 15, is just a draft. And obviously, if you're making marketing authorized applications or making, say, type 2 variations, which require you to revalidate, you're going to need to be very much aware of these new guidances. Now, I can see from the chat facility that you have a number of questions there. There are nearly a couple of hundred people online, so obviously I'm not going to open up the phone lines because that's going to be impossible. I will answer some of the questions in the next 15 minutes, but I'm not going to be able to answer all of them in the time available. So I did just want to introduce to you the fact that this whole topic of modern process validation is going to be explored in much greater detail in a 3.5-day course that we're running in Manchester in the UK in June, in about 6 weeks' time. And so there's a link there that, and you can just go on our website and you could deliver that in-house course. And we can also deliver that in-house for you if you wish. And it's going to go through all of these topics that relate to modern process validation. So let me go back and have a look at some of your questions. One person is saying, will the presentation be available for download? Yes, I am recording this, and we will make it available on our website for download so that you can have a look at it afterwards. Somebody is saying, do we know when the Annex 15, which is currently in a draft, is likely to be finalized? The answer is I can make a guess, but it is only a guess. Comments are due by the end of May, so there's then got to be a period for the EMA to assess those comments. That typically takes at least 6 months. So that is taken us towards the end of this year. It can vary. Some of these things go through fairly quickly. I would say I would have expected a year after the close of comments is probably the minimum time. Some things like Chapter 2, they took many years longer than that. So my guess is we probably won't, the earliest we'll see a final version will be sometime towards the middle of 2015, and that would be then probably active 6 months later. So around the end of 2015, early 2016 is likely to be the earliest that we see a final version of Annex 15, but that is only my guess. Somebody's asking, is there any timeline for the EMA harmonized approach towards it? No, is the short answer. They are trying to work together. They are trying to harmonize, but to be honest, it's hard enough to get Europe to harmonize within itself. As I said before, because you've got these conflicting statements in the process validation guidance around the number of batches, I think you're going to see the scenario where 3 batches is going to continue to be acceptable in some jurisdictions in Europe and others where it's not. Somebody's asking the justification in the protocol. Yes, you're going to have to include it in the protocol. Obviously, for your validation protocol, your rationale for how many batches, and then you're going to have to submit that justification in your marketing authorization application. And it is a complex question. We will spend quite a bit of time on that 3.5-day course looking at, well, what are some of the strategies you can use to justify the number of batches that you need. Do we need some kind of risk assessment? Yes, definitely. The sort of approach that is being adopted is to make it a mixture, look at risk, so look at the degree of variability you've got, look at the criticality of the parameter. If it's not very critical, it's not have a big impact, then you don't need to, the risk is lower, and so you don't need so much confidence as something that is really truly critical to the performance of the product, and therefore you may well need more data. Somebody's asking, can we apply a matrix approach? Yes, you can. You can use matrix approaches and look at the guidance for a bit more detail on that. Is it expected? Yes, let's have a look. Go back through some of the other questions that have been supplied. Is it currently acceptable for one batch in an EU submission? Yes, I suppose it could be, because if you can justify perhaps that either it's one of these cases where you can justify concurrent validation. In other words, the product is only targeted at a very small number of people, and you're unlikely to want to make more than, say, one batch a year or whatever. So that you may be able to justify that. You're going to have to do that on a case-by-case basis. Somebody's asking about the statistical techniques I was talking about. Yes, the statistical techniques that you can use for ongoing process verification are very simple. It is control charts, and you can choose whether you use a Shewhart control chart or perhaps a Q-sum control chart to provide the control. And the other thing is process capability analysis. And if you don't know what they are, we do have a 2-day course covering that in September this year. Again, details on our website. This is definitely something that everybody's going to have to do, because this continued process verification, as the Americans call it, or ongoing process verification, as the Europeans are calling it, is definitely now becoming a requirement. And frankly, it is very easy to do. I describe pharmaceutical companies generally as being data-rich but information poor, because frankly we've done a very poor job of analyzing and extracting the information we need out of the data. So that we can teach you those tools and techniques, and with modern computer systems and computer software, it is extremely easy to do, although you need to make sure you use the techniques properly and understand what they're telling you. So yeah, we do have a 2-day course on, we call it Analyzing and Trending Data, in September this year, and again, you can get details from our website. Medical devices. Somebody's asking about medical devices. I believe, I will admit, medical devices are not an area of my expertise. I'm from the pharmaceutical world, but I believe there is some guidance being published in Europe on medical device validation, but it's separate guidance. And it's separate guidance in the US as well. The US guidance only applies to the drug component of a drug-device combination. So both the FDA and the EMA have separate guidance on validation of medical devices. And I would say, from my limited knowledge of medical devices, it's very much more focused in medical device world on that development phase. That your validation is based entirely on that development phase. You've got to show that you've developed the process in the right way. It is true quality by design in the medical device world. So you would need to follow that. A number of major pharmaceutical companies have fallen foul of that, where they've produced a drug-device combination and frankly have not taken sufficient account of the rules around the medical device component of that drug-device combination. Okay, so I think I'm getting to the end of the questions. Are there any more questions? Somebody's asking, what will the new guideline on PV mean for already validated processes? Well, the answer is, if you don't need to make a change, and this is in Europe, then you can carry on, but you do need to be aware of this ongoing process verification requirement in Annex 15 that will apply to existing processes when that guidance is finalized. You will need to be cognizant in Europe of the new CHMP guidance when you make a new marketing authorization application, or if you change your manufacturing process to the extent that you need to submit a Type 2 variation. Then again, you're likely to need to have that level of detail, and to follow that guidance, you need to think about that at that time. So, if there are any more questions, I haven't got any more questions coming in at the moment. There are no more questions. Somebody's asking, what approaches are other territories adopting? That's a very good question, because this whole, as I said, this new approach is a paradigm shift. It's been adopted. There is draft guidance I've seen come out from WHO, has produced draft guidance which is very similar to the EU CHMP guidance. It's only draft, I believe, still from WHO. I've also seen draft guidance from the ASEAN region, which is the Southeast Asian network. So around the world, other agencies and regions are adopting this much more life cycle science-based approach. It's not universal yet, but I think the fact that it's now been adopted for 3 years by the US, it's now coming into Europe. As I say, we are seeing drafts from organizations like WHO and ASEAN, so I'm sure eventually it will go worldwide. But it's going to be mixed, I would suggest, probably over the next 5 years or so. But I'd go back and emphasize that I think if you follow the FDA guidance, you will be in a very strong position because it's totally science and risk-based, and you will have the data to support whatever you decide because it is so science and risk-based. I think if you stick with the traditional 3 batches, and you may well get away with that in Europe for a few more years yet, it would necessarily apply in other regions, so particularly the FDA at the moment. But again, if other regions tend to adopt something closer to the FDA guidance, you may well find that traditional 3-batch approach is not accepted. Somebody's saying about APIs. If the API guidance, if the American guidance applies to APIs, do you need this ongoing process verification? The answer is yes. You need to be continually monitoring your process throughout the commercialization phase for an API in the US, and this continued process verification phase applies equally there. So all the things about control charting and process capability needs to be taken into account. Okay, so just to remind you, if you want to explore this subject in a lot more detail, we do have the 3.5-day course in 6 weeks' time. I would recommend early registration. We've already got quite a few people registered on that course, so it may well fill up quite quickly. We could always bring the course in-house and tailor it for you if you wish. And there's our contact details, and so you can get all this information from the website. So, any more questions at the moment? Several of you have said thank you for the information, so you're very welcome. This is a big change for the industry, and we need to make sure that you need to make sure, if you're here, that your companies are aware of this change and that you are putting a strategy in place to meet the new expectations. While some of it may still be draft in Europe, this is definitely coming, and if you're selling product into the USA, this has been final guidance from the FDA for 3 years now, so the FDA would see there's very little excuse for you not being aware of it. Okay, so if there are no more questions, I will call the proceedings to a halt at this point. So thank you all for your attention. If you need any more details or wish to have any more information, please contact us by email or by phone at the addresses given on the screen. I will leave those up for a while. So thank you all very much for your attention, and good day to you.